Hello there old hammer lovers, and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to take you through how I painted this Alchemist house that I bought from Molten Prints on eBay. It's, as the name of the seller implies, a 3D print of quite good quality that I plan to use as part of my Warhammer Quest settlements. I found that when playing games of Quest with the kids, it's quite hard to keep track when it gets to visiting towns in between adventures. The roleplay book bases these settlements almost entirely on dice rolls and imagination, but we struggle to keep track sometimes of whereabouts we've visited and where we want to go next. Although it's true that you can buy settlement maps online or keep track with a pen and paper like the good old days, I thought it might be not only good fun to build an actual town to visit, but also having that visual aspect of visiting an actual town with buildings would add another dimension to the game to keep the kids really interested and engaged. This of course could also be used in fantasy as a standard building, and might also be useful for photography purposes when creating scenes and dioramas for my painted miniatures. This particular model comes in 3 separate layers to allow characters to move inside the building if you so wished, but to be honest, that's a step further than I need for my purposes, and the thought of painting the inside details on multiple buildings was enough to put me off. So, I'll probably just glue the parts together once it's completed and in use. So, let's begin by doing a heavy dry brush of this dark grey, which in my opinion is actually a light grey, but that's cheap craft paint for you. I'm literally going to do this on everything except for the kiln, which will be better left in black primer for a dry brush of silver later on. Once everything has received a coat of grey, my next step is to use wildwood contrast paint on all the main structural beams on the house. I thought using contrast on these might save me a little bit of time from having to apply any further coats of paint later on, but in hindsight it didn't really, and I might have been better served just using a black or dark brown like dryad bark. But hey, you have to experiment to learn or you wouldn't get any better at painting. Next up was Agaros Dunes, which again I thought might save me extra layers later on, but it once again let me down in this instance. I applied it to all the windows, shutters and the door. It didn't take long for me to realise I would definitely need to do a bit more work on these areas to get the contrast that I wanted. I decided on painting the roof next, as it was going to be the main source of colour on this building. I went for a Carandas green to do this. My plan for the settlement included having colour-coded buildings to help identify them quickly and easily. So I asked the kids the question, what colour should an alchemist's roof be? And they replied, snotty green, for some reason, but who am I to argue with their logic? Now this is quite a bright and garish green, and maybe with hindsight I should have chosen a slightly more muted tone, but at this point I was keen to crack on and get the house done, so I went with it, tried my best to make it work. I had forgotten to do the wooden barrels when doing the windows and door, so I went back to do those now whilst the roof was drying. After the barrels I checked the roof and noticed the ridge would probably suit being Agaros too, so I gave it a quick coat. Back to wildwood next to do the structural beams on the roof. The darkness of this brown helps to break up the strong green tones, and although I would probably have been better served doing the dry brushing on the tiles before painting these beams, I sometimes find it helps to get the base colours down on the panels first, to help give a visual read on how the building's going to look with all the colours placed. Felt the bricks around the door and the chimney both needed to be a different colour to the main grey bricks on the rest of the building, just to add a bit more interest. I deliberated for a while on using different grey tones, but didn't want to play it ultra safe. I went with brick red, coat de arms for this. I could have used a Citadel equivalent, which I'm not sure the name of right now, but I'm trying to use up the cheaper options available to me on terrain where possible. A black wash of Nuln Oil came next, on pretty much the whole building, now that I had placed most of my colours. I started with the roof and then moved down onto the rest of the building. This really helped to define all the tiles and brickwork, and hopefully would save me a lot of time blacklining everything. I tried highlighting the roof with a dry brush of Warpstone Glow. After a few seconds I realised this wasn't bright enough to make much difference. I moved up the scale to Moot Green for this instead. I gave all the brickwork a dry brush highlight of Administratum Grey to help brighten it up a bit after the black wash. The chimney and door frame received a highlight of Tuscaur Fir, applied once again with a dry brush. Zenisi Desert was applied to everything painted in Agaros Dunes, with, you guessed it, another dry brush. I tried my best to be neat with it, but inevitably it did get a bit on the other parts here and there, so I would need to tidy this up a bit later on. I used Abaddon Black on the door hinges and the handle, a little bit where the roof tiles meet the ridge to define those, and on the metal details of the sign. Cygor Brown was used on all the wooden details next to define the wooden panels, much like black lining, but brown lining. I forgot the barrels again. So back to Abaddon Black to base coat the metal rings that run around the barrels, ready for a coat of silver on them later. I dry brushed the kiln in lead belcher to give a dark metal look. Silver was also applied to the hinges, door handle and sign details, trying to leave some black in the recesses for definition. By the time I'd done this, the black lining on the barrels had dried, so I gave them the silver they required also. Now I did think about filling the barrels with all sorts of weird and wonderful colourful liquids, but in the end I used Pilar Glacier to give a kind of water effect. As the barrels were open and outside, I figured they must be full of water, and all the important chemicals for an alchemist would be kept inside in its little bowls. I decided on Gorfor Brown to highlight the main house beams that I painted with wildwood earlier. As they are all raised up, it wasn't too difficult to keep this quite neat without affecting the rest of the completed paintwork. Painted the sign black before detailing the icon in a bright red, in this case Evil Sun Scarlet. I used some wildwood just to fix a few mistakes on the wood, and after looking at it for a little while thinking something wasn't quite right, I asked for a bit of advice from my friend Nathan, who quite rightly advised that the roof tiles could maybe use a little more shading in between the tiles. So I went in with some Dark Angel's green contrast to put a thin line between each tile to make them pop a little bit more. Doing this though made the chimney and door frame look like they needed some lining too, so I spent 10 more minutes off camera adding some Cygor brown lines to all the recesses on those too. I could easily have ploughed many more hours into this building up more highlights and shadows, but to be honest, with a whole town to paint, I wanted to complete it as quickly as possible, and with about 5 hours painting time spent on this already, I thought that it looked acceptable enough to move on. Here we are, a quick and easy Alchemist House painted. Hope you've enjoyed this little walkthrough, and hopefully it will inspire you to paint a building of your own. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you all in the next one.